Steve, can you hear us?
I'll give him the green light. We'll execute this.
Everybody wanted to welcome Colonel Steve Warren from Operation Inherent Resolve, coming to us live from Baghdad. Steve, without any ado, here we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and good morning, Pentagon Press Corps. I'd like to give a quick overview of the battlefield before we get to questions, and I'll jump right in. As of today, we have conducted 7,712 airstrikes, with 5,032 in Iraq and 2,680 in Syria. In Hawija over the past week, of course, many of you have read about and reported on the hostage rescue operation in Hawija that freed 70 hostages. Here in Iraq, we're all thinking about the family of Master Sergeant Joshua Wheeler. He is a hero. In Ramadi, Iraqi security forces are conducting consolidation and reorganization operations on all 5 axes of attack. The ISF continue to face IEDs, counterattacks spearheaded by VBIDs, and Iraqi forces have held the line. Coalition forces have conducted 26 airstrikes in Ramadi since we last spoke. These strikes have broken several enemy counterattacks and provide maneuver space as the ISF continues to clear obstacles and IED clusters. In Beji, CTS, that's Counterterrorism Service, the federal police and the PMF continue to clear both Beji City and the Beji oil refinery. Coalition airstrikes this weekend killed dozens of enemy fighters, destroyed weapons, equipment, and supplies. Recently, we've seen propaganda stating that the coalition provided supplies to ISIL at the Beji oil refinery. We find this to be laughable. In the High Value Individuals Department, earlier this month, as you know, we killed Sanafi al-Nasser, a Saudi national and the highest-ranking leader of the Khorasan group. For perspective, over the last 13 months, our strikes have had an impact on this group of terrorists. We've killed 13 leaders and more than 100 of their rank and file. Moving to Syria. Regarding the airdrop in Syria, I've seen some press reporting about the ammunition resupply operation that we recently conducted, and I want to once again confirm that we are satisfied the ammunition, the 50 tons of ammunition that we airdropped into Syria was delivered to members of the Syrian Arab Coalition. Continuing Syria, earlier this week we saw intense fighting between pro-regime ISIL and opposition fighters near the Al-Ghab plain, also in Aleppo, Deir al-Zawar, and Talicia. Before we go to questions, I have one last point. Over the last several weeks, what I've tried to do is paint for you a picture of our operations broadly and the impact that those operations are having. Several weeks ago, we spoke about high-value individual, or HVI, strikes that create confusion and sow paranoia. We discussed last week the Omar oil facility strikes and our efforts to break the enemy's war machine by attacking their industrial base. Today, I would like to address some of the new training we're providing Iraqi security forces. The fight that ISF faces requires them to conduct extensive IED clearance and obstacle reduction. To assist our partner with these challenges, we've adjusted our training and our equipping program. We're teaching the Iraqis how to get through the types of obstacles that ISIL has placed around Ramadi, and we're giving them new tools to help. One example is the anti-personnel obstacle breaching system. Here we call it the APOBS. The APOBS is it's kind of an explosive rope attached to a little rocket that can be shot across a minefield and will explode and clear any of the mines or detonate the mines to create a lane that attacking forces can then rush through. 35 of these have been distributed for training and have been issued to the Iraqi security forces. And before we go into questions, I'd like to show you an example of U.S. trainers teaching Iraqi soldiers how to use APOBs. So Divids, hopefully you can hear me. Let's see if this works. We're trying out some new technology.
Standoff.
مثل ما تشوف صاروا الخمينة بالمسافة بحبل يربط هاي بهاي.
Right here. Lay down.
انبطح.
Good. Pull the red.
اسحب. دب هنا.
Pop it.
اسحبها.
Go.
اركض.
Go. Go.
All right, Divots, thank you. That was terrific. And only like 250 man-hours worth of work went into rehearsing that. So very well done. I'll take a round of applause from the audience there for the Divots team who put that together. That's all I've got, and I'm happy to take your questions.
We'll open up with Bob, and otherwise signal me, and we'll call on you next from the list. Bob, go ahead.
Colonel Warren, on Ramadi, you mentioned that the U.S. airstrikes are creating maneuver space for the ISF, but they're still reorganizing and rearming, I think is what you said. So there seems to be a disconnect there between if you're creating maneuver space for them, but they're not ready to maneuver. Could you explain that? And secondly, is this training of this IED clearance training one reason why the Iraqis are not moving forward on Ramadi? Is there a period of training that's going to be required? Additional training, I mean?
So the strikes create the space for the Iraqis to be able to consolidate and reorganize, number one. But number two, and much more importantly, to begin to methodically clear some of the IEDs that have been placed along the longitudinal axis, their axis of advance. So you can place obstacles in two ways, right? You can place them this way, to stop movement, or you can place them along the road, which kind of slows you in depth. And so what these airstrikes do is keep the enemy at bay while the ISF can come through and methodically clear those IEDs that have been placed. And so really what it is, the ISF exerted a lot of energy, gaining a fairly significant chunk of territory over the 2 weeks ago, roughly 15 kilometers. That's a sizable amount. There was a fairly broad sweeping maneuver where one of the divisions kind of moved southwest and around and came in on the western axis. So that's a lot of energy there, a lot of ammunition expended. So the Iraqi security forces simply have to, kind of, again, consolidate and reorganize. This is a very deliberate process where we get some fresh troops on the battlefield, replenish equipment stores, et cetera, et cetera. So while these APOBs and other types of engineering, training, and equipping will facilitate, there is no specific delay. It's just simply a matter of the pace of the battle.
Joe Tabbitt.
Colonel Warren, this is Joe Tabbitt. On a strategic level, what has changed since the Hawija operation? Can we expect to see U.S. combat troops with the ISF? Will you be deploying any Apache's helicopter to assist the Iraqi forces?
Joe, nothing's changed about our policy since the Hawija operation. You've heard the Secretary speak, I think, fairly extensively about fine-tuning and adjustments. We're going to continue our train, advise, and equip missions. We are going to increase or step up some of our airstrikes against the enemy's industrial base. We're trying to destroy their ability to make money. We're trying to destroy their ability to generate equipment. We're trying to destroy their ability to command and control themselves. And we'll continue that and potentially even increase it. Apaches have been in Iraq since the very beginning of this, and they remain here.
Tom Bowman.
Hey, Steve, I wanted to get into some numbers with you for a second. Last time we talked, you said the Syrian Arab Coalition has roughly 5,000 fighters. You said that number wouldn't be sufficient to press Raqqa. So I know you can't get into specifics, but roughly how many more would they need? Is it several thousand more, et cetera? And also, the YPG, roughly how many fighters do they have? Because presumably they would take part in this fight as well. And lastly, a ballpark on how many ISIS are actually in Raqqa itself.
Tom, what I said was the 5,000 members of the Syrian Arab Coalition would not be enough to take Raqqa. They were certainly able to pressure Raqqa, right? And there's a difference. Regarding the overall size of the friendly forces that we have there, you know, I hesitate to get into specific numbers. What I'll give you is kind of broad ballparks. You know, in the vicinity, 30 to 40,000 total fighters, total, men under arms, throughout that northern Syria region. Tom, I don't have a good count for enemy inside Iraq. I just don't have that number with me. We'll do some digging and see if I can't get something for you.
Is there a ballpark number? Is it several thousand?
Honestly, that's just not a number I've ever looked for, so I don't even have a ballpark number in my head. But that's a gettable number. We'll get it for you and flip it over to you.
Steve, Jennifer Griffin, three questions. Why isn't the Iraqi government stopping the Russian cargo flights coming from Iran going into Syria? That's one. And why so few airstrikes by U.S. coalition forces in Syria since the Russians have come on the scene? And then I'll follow up.
Jennifer, thanks for that. The Iraqi government is a sovereign government. They get to make their own decisions. We certainly have expressed privately our opinions with the government of Iraq, but at the end of the day, they get to decide how their airspace is used. Regarding airstrikes in Syria, I guess my number one point on airstrikes in Syria is that it has nothing to do with the Russians, nothing whatsoever. It has to do with a lot of different things. The first and most important is really just the care that we take selecting and striking targets. You got to remember, every strike that we do is part of a broader operational picture, right? It's part of a big whole. And so what I got here, in anticipation of your question, is I got a chart. I don't know if you can see that. There we go. So that, actually, David, you have that chart. Can you just flip it up?
You, Steve.
Hey, David, can they still hear me? Here is a chart that charts out the number of strikes per month since the beginning of these operations. So, and it ends in September because obviously October is not yet complete. Yeah. Okay, we can pull it down now. Just put me back. Plug me back in. Okay, so here we have an example or a chart that lays out how many strikes we've done per month since the beginning of these operations. I gave this chart to Alyssa. She can distribute it digitally to whoever needs it. So what you see here is that there are high months and there are low months. And again, the point I want to make is that while we are lower this month, we'll finish out October roughly on par with September at our current pace. So we've seen dips in March of 15, November 14. Obviously, we're just getting started, and we've seen spikes both in January of 15 and July of 15. So I throw that up there only to create some perspective. So yes, the last 3 months, obviously there has been a reduction in strikes. But what's important is that it's tied to operation. It's tied to our operations. There's been an increase in the ground operations in Iraq, and a concurrent increase in the amount of air power that we've sent there. You've heard the Secretary of Defense speak recently that he plans to increase the amount of infrastructure or industrial-based targets that we strike, across the battlefield. So I expect that you're going to see an increase in Syria strikes overall, here relatively soon. So there is nothing to do with the Russians. It's really more about the ebb and flow of battle, the pace of battle, and where our priority of efforts are. And as we've placed some additional focus on Ramadi and on Beji, well, obviously that's where more of our assets have gone. Jennifer, I spent so much time answering that question, I forgot your other one.
Just a quick follow-up. The ammunition that you dropped, the 50 tons of ammunition in northern Syria, how is that in compliance, or is there any question about whether it complies with UN Security Council resolutions which don't allow weapons to be sent into Syria?
So, as you know, the Syria Train and Equip mission has been ongoing now for many months. It started in Kobani almost a year ago when we airdropped ammunition to the fighters there in Kobani, trying to hold off ISIL as they flung themselves at that city. So this is simply an extension of that. Of course, that the earlier Syria Train and Equip, where we withdrew forces, trained them, equipped them, pushed them back in, loaded down with weapons and ammunition. So this is simply an extension of that. I'm not versed in the UN resolutions, but what I can tell you is that this is a continuation of the program that we've been doing now for quite some time.
Nancy, I had you as an ambiguous.
Well,
Were you raising your hand?
I am raising
my own fault if I didn't.
Steve, I had two questions. One, yesterday the Secretary testified that the new strategy involved 3 Rs, Ramadi, Raqqa, and raids. And my question is, what happened to Mosul, other than it doesn't fit the rhyme? Is it that Mosul is too far off? And why is there a belief that Mosul is harder than Raqqa, which has been the longest standing city held under ISIS?
Good question. Mosul, of course, is part of the puzzle, but I think the Mosul operations, ground operations for Mosul anyway, are probably a little bit further out. And one of the things we believe is that, again, here recently we've begun to look at ISIL as a operational or a wider problem, rather than look simply at Iraq as one fight and Syria as another fight. We're now looking at ISIL as the fight, whether they're in Iraq or Syria. And so operationally, if you lay a map down and look at it, what you see is pressure on Raqqa will relieve some of the pressure, will relieve some of the enemy influence, we believe, in Mosul. So by taking Ramadi, and then by pressuring, we don't, I won't get into that level of detail whether or not Raqqa needs to be fully liberated or simply pressured. I'm not going to get into all of that. But what I'll tell you is that after Ramadi and pressure on Raqqa is really, we believe, going to be kind of one of the keys that unlocks the entire ISIL enterprise, which will then get us into Mosul, if that makes sense. And what was the rest of your question? I can't remember.
One other. We keep hearing that there are plans being put together in terms of using U.S. forces on the ground as advisors at a brigade level and some other recommendations. My understanding is that it's now in General McFarland's hands. Can you give us a sense on when he will put those recommendations forward and what kind of timeline we're looking at for any possible announced changes in the U.S. approach?
Well, it's probably better for me to let that come out of Washington, right? I mean, we down here made our analysis and moved it up to CENTCOM. Once it gets to Tampa, we no longer have control of it. It then goes to the Pentagon and both on the DoD and the Joint Staff side, and then from there, even higher. So unfortunately, I can't help you with that. That's really a Washington announcement.
Has now done his part. That is, it's outside of Iraq's hands in terms of where those recommendations go. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. Now, as you know, I mean, this is an iterative process, right? And there's discussions, and and phone calls and things. You know, we have provided our input here from the ground. That input goes to the central commander of Central Command, and then from there up through the chain of command.
Hi, Steve. Missy Ryan. On the Syrian Arab coalition and the plan to pressure or take Raqqa, can you just circle back and tell us a little bit more about how far they are from being able to do that and what they require in order to sort of launch operations? My understanding is that they've been in a sort of planning mode, but what do they require to be able to execute? And then secondly, Secretary Carter said yesterday that there were going to be, as Nancy said, more raids as part of the strategy going forward in Iraq. Will the increase in raids, will that require additional enabler assets in Iraq in terms of search and rescue assets or other enablers, additional personnel to support the increase in those sort of risky operations?
Missy, I'll start with the second part, and the answer is simply it depends. You know, there wasn't a requirement for a substantial increase, or at least for a permanent increase, to support the operation we saw in Harija. You know, what you see maybe is a temporary increase. Conduct the operation, and then you know, repositioning after that. So you know, again, always hesitant to get into kind of tactical level details, but it really would depend. I think it's important to make clear, and hopefully it's been made clear enough through Washington. But you know, I am not aware of any plan to, you know, substantially increase the presence here, or to begin conducting, you know, kind of these major ground operations that you saw here back in 2006 or you know, in previous. I mean, what we're talking about is more of what we recently saw, which is, you know, when there's an opportunity and when we have a willing partner, capable and able partner, then you know, we'll put our support behind that and execute. And you know, just as a reminder, this is nothing new, right? I mean, I sensed a little bit of you know, outside the wire for the first time, kind of surprise. But I would remind everyone that we put forces on Sinjar Mountain well over a year ago. I would remind everyone that we sent evaluators to the Mosul Dam, you know, 8 months ago. I would remind everyone that, you know, we did conduct a raid inside of Syria 6 months ago. So the idea that this is kind of a brand new thing, a major shift, that all of a sudden people are leaving the wire, is simply wrong. And you know, it's a very short-sighted look at this operation. So I would encourage everyone to just kind of take that perspective from where we sit here. You know, the operation in Hawija, while you know, heartbreaking that we lost a man, yet at the same time, it's satisfying that we were able to, you know, to save, you know, 70 people from, you know, execution. This is not a radical departure from what has happened. We have sent people outside the wire before when the conditions warranted it, and what the Secretary has said is we're going to keep doing that. And you know, we'll keep a sharper eye out for more opportunities. But this is not a major shift. This is not anything. You know, this is not anything radically different than what we've seen, you know, for the last year.
Syrian Arab coalition was the second part of the question. How far away are they from doing?
That's right. So in Syria, the Syrian Arab coalition and pressure on Raqqa. You know, I don't want to give away their kind of operational security. What I'll tell you is, you know, now freshly armed with 50 tons of ammunition, you are going to see, I predict that you are going to see movement in the very near future. So, and again, these things are always iterative, right? They build on top of one another. So, you know, this was an opportunity, you know, for us to give this ammunition to the Syrian Arab coalition, allow them to conduct, you know, a scaled operation to test this theory, to make sure that this works the way we want it to work. You know, we tried once in Syria, we didn't get the results we wanted, and now we're trying something new, and we have to wait and see if we get the results we want.
Hi, Colonel Colonel Warren, this is June Torbati with Reuters. I just wanted to follow up on Jennifer's question. Can I draw you out a little bit more on the limitations you're facing between the competing priorities between Iraq and Syria, and focusing more airstrikes in Iraq means you're taking away from Syria? And is it personnel, equipment, and have you asked for more resources to be able to address both at the same time? And then just as a follow-up, you said a few weeks ago that you had looked at the average number of airstrikes in Syria and it was 8 per day. Just wondering if you had an updated estimate or number on that.
I haven't crunched those numbers, so I don't have a daily average yet. But we can probably run that down. Resources, one thing I know is that in the history of warfare, no commander's ever felt like he had too much resources. So let's get that out first. That said, we believe that we do have, resources adequate to meet our mission. But as in any military operation, there's always a priority of effort. I mean, any military operation. One of the fundamentals that you learn is how to prioritize your fires. And so there's always going to be a shift, and there's always going to be a movement of both ISR and fires. And that's what commanders are for. The commanders are there to decide who gets the priority. Does the priority go here, or does the priority go here? And that doesn't mean that nothing goes to other places, but that just identifies where the priorities are. And so that's what happens. Again, and don't take it just as I don't want to leave you with a bad impression that the only reason there have been limited strikes in Syria over the last several days is because of Ramadi. That's not the case at all. Again, it's a combination of factors. There's environmental factors. There is our process for finding exactly the right target that we want to hit, waiting for that target to become available to hit, with our ability to minimize and mitigate the potential for civilian casualties or damage to infrastructure. So we put a lot of energy into developing targets, and we will continue to develop targets and continue and refine them and redevelop them and watch them and make sure that those targets meet our standards for minimizing destruction to civilian infrastructure and, of course, for civilian casualties. So, it's a lot of things. That's why I showed you the slide. All right, to tell you that this is not some unique situation. There's ups and there's downs, and it's tied to everything from the pace of the operation to our target development cycle and process. Does that help? Because ask me a follow-up if it doesn't.
Thank you very much.
Tom. Hi, Colonel. It's Tom here from AFP. Given that it has seemed difficult to find actionable targets in Syria, and also given the Secretary's comments yesterday that you're going to intensify strikes, and considering what you just said, how exactly are you going to develop new targets in this region that you haven't been striking in recent days? And also, I had a question about Ramadi. It seems like you've been talking for weeks about the progress along these various axes and the explosive minefields and so on. Do you have a timeline? Can you give us actually a better impression of when Ramadi is going to be retaken?
Thanks for that. I can't and won't give you a timeline for when Ramadi will be retaken. It's a tough fight. There's a lot of obstacles. There's a determined, dug-in enemy. So this fight is going to continue. I'm confident that Ramadi will be liberated, but I'm not going to predict a timeline. I try not to do that because I always get it wrong. On target development, the way we'll do this is several ways. One, as we gain intelligence, we gain new targets, right? And everything we do helps us gain more intelligence. We, as the Secretary said, gained a trove of intelligence just from our operation in Hawija. And then, of course, we have other methods for gaining intelligence, which leads to the development or the nomination of targets. The other thing that's important to know is, we have a willing, capable, and consistent ground partner here in Iraq. So, of course, it's easier. And, of course, we've got 10 years of experience, 12, 13 years of experience in Iraq. So we know Iraq better, as a force. So that helps us with target development as well. So, the intelligence in Syria continues to pile up. We continue to sift through it and develop targets and nominate targets. We are continuing to make ties with forces on the ground in Syria. That will spur target development as well. So it's a long process, but it's a process that's continuing being refined, continuing being built on, and has resulted in, I think, real impacts on the ground.
I know you said that Russia has no bearing on what your operations are, but has there ever been a case where you've seen increased Russian activity and decided to steer clear of that area that otherwise you might have targeted?
Yeah, and I think those have come out. I mean, there was one where there was, I think we announced it 2 or 3 weeks ago, where some aircraft were moving from point A to point B. They saw Russians operating in the area. They decided to approach that target from a different angle. By the time they had swung around to get the new angle of attack, the target that they'd seen had dispersed. So they weren't able to execute those strikes. So these kind of things are going to happen, but it hasn't hampered our operations. I mean, there's going to be adjustments, but impact is minimal at best.
Thank you.
McIntyre.
Hi, Colonel Warren. It's Jamie McIntyre. I was struck by the testimony yesterday by Secretary Carter, who just almost said as an aside that the Russian airstrikes, the Russians were using a very high percentage of dumb bombs. I think he said 85 to 90%. I don't have it in front of me. Considering that Russia considers itself, a high-tech superpower, I found it startling to hear that in this day and age they were using such a high percentage of non-precision, or as we like to say, directionally challenged bombs. Can you give us any more information about that? And also, what does it say about the way they're conducting operations there?
Yeah, so we've seen the same thing here. Majority, I guess two points to note. Number one, despite what the Russians said about their desire to combat ISIL, only a small fraction of their strikes have been in areas where ISIL is operating. And in fact, some of their strikes have allowed ISIL to maneuver on forces that are friendly to us, so which we find concerning. The Russians have chosen to use a majority of really just dumb bombs, just gravity bombs, push them out the back of an airplane and let them fall where they will. We find this to be reckless and irresponsible. We've also, there's been reporting that the Russians are using cluster munitions in Syria, which we also find to be irresponsible. These munitions will, they have a high dud rate, they can cause damage they can hurt civilians, and they're just, not good. So we've seen all of this. And it is cause for concern. The Russians say that they want to help us, or that they want to help fight ISIL, but their actions simply don't support that.
Hi, Brian Everstein with Air Force Magazine. Back to your numbers at the top, just to go back to the issue of airstrikes in Syria. There had been 10 within the past week, and that was since the F-16s rotated out and the A-10s came into Incirlik. Have these airstrikes mean that the A-10s have been active in Syria? And can you give us any detail on these airstrikes, what was targeted, anything about the nature of them? And I have a second question about the MOU with Russia. Since there was a line of communication set up, has that been used at all?
So every single time we do an airstrike, it gets listed on our daily airstrike release. And on that, we list, where the strike was conducted and then what was hit. So go back and check those, and you'll know exactly what we struck. On the F-16s and A-10s, I don't have in front of me exactly, and we kind of don't get into that. We don't really get into, hey, it was an A-10 here, an A-10 there. The A-10s are in place, and we'll conduct, air operations in support of this the minute they're up and fully running. And I don't know I don't have their status right now. And then finally, what was the last question again?
Communication with Russia, has that been used since MOU was signed?
So on the MOU, it's in, right. Yep. Yeah, so this MOU is in place. I don't know if you guys have seen it. I don't know if we made that public or not. It gives, certain things, just some very technical things about how to act in the air. Establishes a radio frequency. We'll have to check. I don't know. I'll call up AFCENT, or maybe Liz can call AFCENT and find out whether or not we've actually used that frequency to be in touch with the Russians. I just don't have that answer. It's a good question, though. We'll get that for you.
Hey, Colonel Warren, it's Kevin Barron. I wonder if you can go back to the raids and the timeline you just gave. So the timeline you gave would lead to the conclusion, if you're the American public, that before this last raid for the hostages, that there wasn't one since the Abu Sayyaf raid. These are all that we hear about. And one of them was something, we understand why he promoted it. It was a big HVI now, not HVT. I don't know why he made that switch. It was a big grab. But this last raid, I wonder, was there any plan to tell the public about this beforehand, or did we just know about it only because it went bad? There was a Title 10 operator who was killed. There were 70, not 20 hostages as expected, and there was helmet cam footage showing up after the fact. It kind of sounds like, not to be combative with you, but this combat operation was not something we were supposed to know about, and we're only finding out about it because things went south. And so going forward, are we, or is the American public, going to know more about these operations happening?
Well, I think saving 70 people from execution and labeling that as a raid gone bad, I think is wrong and borders on disrespectful to the men and women who actually participated in that operation. So I disagree with your assessment. In fact, I'd like to issue a full-throated disagreement with that assessment. No operation is perfect in the history of operations. We knew the Kurds were going to release that video. They released it a little earlier than we thought they would, but this is something that was part of our plan. And I think we do a very good job of being transparent and reading out operations as they happen. I think I can stand on our record pretty firmly that when we conduct an operation, if there are not some off-the-chart sensitivities, we read that operation out. That's part of our duty, and we do that duty. I think we're very diligent about it.
On that briefly, you say that you're pretty transparent, and yet we've asked if there are any prior raids and have not been able to get an answer. And I would point out that a week before the raid, in Afghanistan, an F-16 came under attack, and we only got details about it days after when the Taliban released videos. So to Kevin's question, will we know about future raids as they happen, and can we get a number of, if there are any previous raids other than the two that have been publicly mentioned?
Fair question. The answer is no. There haven't been any other raids. We've read out every single raid and operation that we've done here. Everything from putting troops in harm's way on Sinjar Mountain well over a year ago, up to the operation in Hawija. We've read every single one of those raids out, and we'll continue to do so. I can't speak to Afghanistan.
I'd like to follow up myself.
Actually, it's your turn anyway. Maybe,
okay,
so you have the floor.
Jim Miklashevsky. The two raids, Sinjar Mountain, as we understood it at the time anyway, was a humanitarian assessment effort in terms of the ground forces there, and airstrikes, of course, against enemy forces. And as Kevin mentioned, the Abu Sayyaf was going after a specific target. But this appears to be, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the first time that U.S. military forces have embedded with indigenous forces on what turned out to be a combat operation. So is this not, the Hawija operation, is that the first time that that has happened?
It is, Jim. This is the first mission of its type that we've conducted here. Yes.
It is something new, is it not?
Added on that, I guess thus far there haven't been any, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, that was it. It is new.
It's just the delay.
Is it not?
Yeah. I mean, this is the first time we have done a mission with exactly these parameters. U.S. Special Operations Forces embedded with Peshmerga forces conducting a raid to free hostages from an ISIL prison. My broader point is it's not the first time that U.S. forces have gone, outside of their cantonment areas. We have had forces forward. We're going to continue to have forces forward as the situation requires.
But the Secretary just last Friday said we can expect more of these such raids. This is not just a humanitarian effort or going after a single. These are actual combat missions by indigenous forces. Are we going to see American forces going forward embedded with indigenous forces from this point on? Something that we were led to believe would not happen.
Right. So I think what you're going to see is more of what we saw in Hawija. So you're not going to see, what we saw in 2006, which is, a large presence of U.S. forces, out there at every level with the entire Iraqi army pressing the fight. I don't think you're going to see that. What I think you're going to see is specific missions where, when the conditions are right, number one, of course, we need a request from the government of Iraq. Let's be clear about that. Number two, capable and willing and able partners on the ground, whether they are PESH or ISF or CTS, whatever the case may be. So, and again, I think with the key thing there being raids, right? So we're not talking, full-blown attacks or assaults on cities, major cities. You're talking about raids, which has a very, that is a doctrinal term, a very specific term, a raid where, there's a combat action is conducted to achieve a certain objective, and then the forces are then removed. And so that, I think, is a very key subtlety, a very key doctrinal point that it's important to make. So that's part of where the Secretary kind of laid it out as, one of his R's, raids. So this is not embedding, thousands of Americans with thousands or tens of thousands of Iraqis to conduct, sustained offensive operations. And so I think it's a very important point. It's important to know what this is and what this is not. And I would argue almost that what it's not is every bit as important. So does that help? And follow up if it doesn't, Jim, because this is an important point, and I want to make sure I'm clear on it.
You asked, does it help? Is it is or is it ain't? Is it combat operations?
No, I guess that's a fair question. And so Sergeant Wheeler died in combat. Let's be very clear about that. He was killed in action. He died during a combat mission, combat operation. So that's what this is. But again, what this is not is what you saw in here in Iraq and everywhere from 2003, where it was divisions, thunder running across Iraq. And destroying an entire army. What it is not is what you saw in 2006 and 2008, major concentrations of U.S. forces actively conducting patrolling, actively conducting attacks on specific enemy known locations in order to gain, seize, and hold territory. It's not any of that. What it is an opportunity. It's an acknowledgement that as we see an opportunity to conduct a raid, which again, to go back over doctrine, is a mission where forces enter the battle space, they conduct their mission, and then they depart the battle space, right? That's a raid. So what this is raids, where, and whether they're partnered, as we saw in Hawija, or whether they're unilateral, as we saw against Abu Sayyaf. The Secretary has simply made clear that this is something that's been successful, and we're going to reinforce success.
Just to follow up on Jim's question, it's Jennifer here. Are you ruling out that U.S. combat forces can be embedded with Iraqi forces as they move on Raqqa and Ramadi? Because those were also two other R's that were mentioned by the Secretary yesterday, and you're talking about simply partnering in raids. Are you ruling out U.S. forces being involved in Raqqa and Ramadi?
Jennifer, it is absolutely not my place to rule anything in or out. All I'm here is talking about what's happening right now. So I'll leave that one for the Secretary to answer, or for Washington to answer. What I'll tell you is that you're going to see increased pressure on these places from the air as of now, through our partner forces on the ground, and as opportunities arise and the conditions are right, we will conduct raids.
Just to follow up on this, the same issue. Hey, Steve, it's Tom Bowman again. The President said last year, June of 14, when he announced the Advise and Assist mission, he said specifically, this will not be combat. Americans will not be engaged in combat. He wasn't subtle at all. So it sounds like from what the Secretary said and from what you're saying, this was a combat mission. So are you violating what the Commander-in-Chief said? Or is this all being done with a wink and a nod to somehow, you know, bamboozle the American people that their sons and daughters are going into harm's way, and you're calling it Advise and Assist?
Yeah. I think there's been an awful lot of energy around making rhetorical hay out of a few of these words. If anyone thought that our pilots who are dropping bombs both in Iraq and Syria for the last year are not in harm's way, they're not paying attention. There's a reason I carry a gun with me everywhere I go. There's a reason, you know, we are handing out combat patches. I'm wearing one right now to everyone who comes here. So I think with the President, and far be it for me to interpret the Commander-in-Chief, but I think what you've seen is kind of, again, people trying to make rhetorical hay, but yet really understanding what's going on. I mean, of course, I mean, this is a combat zone, right? There's a war going on in Iraq, if folks haven't noticed. And we're here, and it's all around us. So this is a dangerous place. You know, we've had a man killed. We've had men, personnel wounded. And that's going to continue to happen. We will continue to give out combat patches. We'll continue to collect imminent danger pay. So again, it's what it is and what it isn't. This is a dangerous place. And there are thousands of Americans in harm's way right now. That said, what you won't see is what I've kind of outlined several times already. What you won't see is major ground formations. There's no tanks here. There's no tank formations here. There's not assaults being conducted by American personnel, by American forces. There are not you know, defense in depth established. There are not you know, cities and towns being liberated by American forces. That is the job of the Iraqi security forces. Here is the job of friendly Syrian forces in Syria. Our job is to advise, assist, and on occasion accompany. But let there be no mistake. There's a war happening in Iraq right now. ISIL is fighting both the Iraqis and the Syrians. So I think it's important to be clear on what is and what is not. Does that help?
Richard. Yeah, hi, Steve. Richard Sisk. I wonder, Steve, at this point, is it possible to give any detail on what happened in Hawija? For instance, there were reports out there that the assault had stalled, and it was the master sergeant who ran to the wall of the compound, blew a hole in the wall, and that's when he was hit. Is there any accuracy to that?
Richard, I don't know about the blowing the hole in the wall piece. I know that the Peshmerga forces were bottled up, receiving direct fire, having some of the members of the Pesh were getting wounded, and this is what triggered the advisors to then begin to assist. And Sergeant Wheeler, in a display of heroism, was at the forefront of that.
Colonel Warren, Barbara Starr, can we go back over a few things? You just said a minute ago that several troops have been wounded in action, or wounded. Giving credit to Nancy, who first reported that there have been 5 wounded. Can you please tell us what the circumstances were of these 5 Americans, military members being wounded? And then I have a couple of follow-ups.
Barbara, I don't have the details of all 5. I know one was hit in the nose by, it's unclear whether it was actually a ricochet or a chip from a concrete wall that he was looking over, or whether it was the actual round itself. So that's the one I know. The others, I don't have those details available. I haven't seen them. You know, and I don't want to speculate. I know we do, you know, I mean, there's indirect fire incidents from time to time, probably on the order, it's hard to say. I mean, there's weeks when we get, you know, 2 or 3 a day, and then recently, over the last couple weeks, it's been very quiet. I don't recall any reports of indirect fire at any of our locations. So I don't have those details. I don't know if we can get them or not. I can certainly look into it. Yeah, what was the rest of your question again?
Will you please take that question? We've all known about the incident at the wall for many, many months, but you've also now said there's direct fire and all of that. So if 4 Americans have actually been wounded by enemy fire or friendly fire, will you please take that question and provide an answer soonest, because somebody would certainly know that information. I mean, did they get wounded, or was it some other thing that caused, kinetic thing that caused them to be injured? So first, can you please tell us how these other 4 Americans were wounded? And is it only 4? Are there any additional? Have you had any friendly fire incidents that have led to anybody being wounded? And I want to go back over this just one more time. I don't think any of us are misunderstanding that this is not force-on-force 2003 major land and air combat operations. But I think what we would like to really endeavor to know is, are U.S. forces in combat? It seems a very simple question, and it seems that those who work for the Defense Department seem to have some sort of guidance given to them that they're not allowed to say that. And I don't get it.
I don't know about any guidance. I can tell you, you know, we're in combat. I think I thought I made that pretty clear, so I'll clear it up. Of course it is. That's why we all carry guns. That's why we all get combat patches when we leave here. That's why we all receive imminent danger pay. So of course it's combat. But what it isn't, again, I think it's just important to know what this is and what this isn't. And you yourself outlined what it is not. But of course it's combat. You know, our aviators are conducting combat air patrols, and that's the name of the mission, combat air patrol. So of course it's combat. You know, they're conducting combat. You know, when you're a pilot and you strike an enemy target with thousands of pounds of bombs, that's aerial combat right there. So yeah, of course we're in combat here.
Obama said is that the country would not go back to where it was in large, I believe not to quote him exactly, but he talked about it wouldn't go back to where it was in previous years. That's not what he was looking for. Does the military have, do you think there's some concern to make sure you don't go back to that, will your recommendations fall short of that? The recommendations that the U.S. military is working on right now, they fall short of returning to major land combat. Would that be accurate?
That would be accurate.
Couple more here. Time for. Let's go to Jennifer again.
Excuse me?
Didn't you raise your hand for a follow-up? Or are you good to go? Okay. Sorry. Tom Bowman, you're good. I think we're good then. Anyone else? Last call. Steve, thank you very much. You've been very generous with your time. We appreciate especially the visual aids. That was a nice touch. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, everybody.